Ah, my dear listeners, close your eyes and imagine yourself at the beginning of one of the most pivotal moments in history. The end of an era is coming, but it's not a destruction. It's the sign of a rebirth. This is the sound of the Renaissance approaching. The gloomy shadows of the Middle Ages are slowly giving way to light. The people of that time, weighed down by the heavy hand of the church and the feudal system, were thirsting for knowledge and freedom. Minds had been shackled for so long, but those chains were about to break. But why at this moment? Why was there a sudden explosion of art, science, and thought across Europe? The answer lies in both the depths of the human spirit and the shifting world order. Centuries of wars, famines, and plagues. People lived in darkness, yet they carried a light within. The Renaissance was the rebirth of humanity during this dark period. An awakening, an enlightenment. Get ready, because you're about to hear the full story of this great awakening in all its details. Ah, Italy. A beautiful land where the sun shines generously and the sea breezes refresh the human spirit. It was here, in the late 14th century, that a great movement, the Renaissance, began to sprout, changing the course of history. To understand this period, we need to grasp the spirit of Italy at that time. It was an era when independent city-states, like Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Rome, were both competing with each other and engaging in significant cultural and commercial interactions. So how did these cities become the cradle of an artistic and intellectual revolution? Trade, my dear friends. These Italian city-states in the Mediterranean were a bridge between the East and the West as Europe began to emerge from the gloomy darkness of the Middle Ages. Ships sailing from Venice reached as far as Byzantine and Ottoman territories, carrying silk, spices, and precious stones. All this commercial activity led to the wealth of Italian cities, and wealth, of course, nourished art, science, and thought. Now close your eyes and imagine Florence. This city, rising along the banks of the Arno River, became the heart of trade, the capital of art, and the birthplace of the Renaissance. Which family shaped this period, you ask? The Medici family, of course. The Medici were the noble and wealthy banking family of Florence, and they were among the most important figures that enabled the Renaissance, not only through their financial power but also by their support for art and science. Cosimo de' Medici was the first great leader of the family, and with his significant investments in the arts, he transformed Florence into a cultural capital. As you walk the streets of Florence, think of Michelangelo's sculptures or Leonardo da Vinci's designs. They were all part of this movement. In those days, art and science were practically intertwined. Mathematics helped unlock the secrets of perspective, while anatomy aimed to understand the mysteries of the human body. Renaissance artists began to reinterpret humanity, nature, and the world in their works. This was a herald of a significant change against the absolute dominance of the church. People were no longer merely servants of God, they were beings striving to understand the world around them. And so, the birth of the Renaissance in Italy began with the wealth provided by trade, the support of great families like the Medici for the arts, and the cultural rise of cities like Florence, and the invention of the printing press. Oh, what a monumental turning point it was. This invention, which changed the fate of Europe, turned the course of history in a completely different direction. In the mid-15th century, in the city of Mainz, Germany, a man named Johann Gutenberg accomplished one of humanity's most significant inventions, the printing press. Now, don't think of this as just another development, dear listeners. Back in those days, accessing information was a privilege reserved for the elite. Books were written by hand, and pages of text were painstakingly copied over hours, days, and sometimes even years. So obtaining a book required spending a fortune. Gutenberg's printing press changed everything. Now, a book could be reproduced quickly and easily. It was at this point that the broad intellectual movement of the Renaissance began to spread across Europe. Not just the elite, but larger segments of the population could access information. Yes, my dear friends, the spread of knowledge gained tremendous momentum. Artists, scientists, philosophers, their ideas were no longer confined to papers stuck in a corner, but were traveling to every corner of Europe. Imagine that with this revolution starting in the 1450s, literary and scientific texts became widespread. Dante's Divine Comedy, Erasmus's works, Machiavelli's writings. These texts were no longer confined within the walls of palaces, they were circulating among the people. As the fire of the Renaissance spread throughout Europe, the sparks of reform began to show themselves gradually. One of the greatest impacts of the printing press was undoubtedly the spread of religious texts. The Bible began to be printed not only in Latin but also in local languages. For the first time, people could read and understand sacred texts in their own languages. This brought about a wave of questioning, laying the foundations for reform movements. Reformist leaders took advantage of the printing press to reach the masses with their ideas. The invention of the printing press didn't just democratize access to knowledge in Europe, it also ignited the fuse for intellectual and religious revolutions. The door that the printing press opened would never close again, permanently nourishing Europe's intellectual awakening. Oh, dear listeners, think about it. The ink on those pages carried not just words but also the way of thinking, lifestyle, and even worldview of an entire era. The impact of the printing press didn't just spread knowledge, it initiated a process of enlightenment that resonated through the very soul of Europe. Thinking about how the Renaissance began in Italy and spread across Europe is key to understanding how this intellectual awakening grew like a wave during that time. But dear listeners, this awakening didn't spread uniformly to every corner of Europe as it did in Italy. When it reached Northern Europe, the Renaissance took on a different form. While the Italian Renaissance thrived on aesthetics and scientific pursuits rooted in ancient Greek and Roman culture, Northern Europe saw the emergence of a wave of humanism that focused more on deep philosophical questioning and human values. The Northern Renaissance had a much greater impact on the beliefs and social lives of the people compared to the artistic and scientific revolution in Italy. Instead of mythological and ancient themes, a way of thinking that concentrated on everyday life, religious values, and the moral structures of society developed. Thinkers like Erasmus worked to bring humanism to the service of the people. Desiderius Erasmus was a great scholar from the Netherlands. He openly criticized the corruption of the church and the shallowness of scholastic thought. His writings sparked the fire of a humanist renaissance in the North as well. Thomas More, a contemporary of Erasmus, was another significant representative of this humanist movement. Ah, my friends, is there anyone among you who hasn't heard of More's famous work, Utopia? Imagine a society where justice and equality reign. As More described an ideal community, he was actually delivering sharp critiques of the injustices, corruption, and social conflicts of his own time. While the Northern Renaissance brought about such a profound change in the world of thought, it also gained a different kind of brilliance in the art world. While the dazzling works of the Italian Renaissance emerged from artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, masters in Northern Europe, such as Jan van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer, showcased their unique styles. Jan van Eyck revolutionized realism. The details in his work seemed to come alive before your eyes. Each brushstroke was like a window opening to the real world. Van Eyck mastered the oil painting technique, making art almost as clear as a photograph. Albrecht Dürer was not just a painter but also a thinker and scientist. His art blended the spirit of the North with Italian influences, while his finely crafted engravings and detailed portraits brought together art and science. Dürer skillfully wove the humanist ideas of the Renaissance into his art. So, my friends, the Northern Renaissance showed us that art was not just a visual pleasure, but also a tool for thought. And it was this wave of humanism that began to flourish in Northern Europe, deeply impacting art, philosophy, religion, and societies. However, these influences were felt not just in the world of aristocrats or intellectuals, but also in the daily lives of ordinary people. People started to question not only the dogmas of the church, but also the value of humanity, the importance of the individual, and the freedom of thought. Ah, dear listeners, the Renaissance thus reached the tranquil lands of Northern Europe, sparking a great intellectual and artistic revolution there as well. People began to rediscover themselves, no longer just as creations of God, but as beings with the capacity for thought and human values. Ah, my dear friends, now we're stepping into a period that deeply shook the spirit of Europe. This is a time of great storms on the historical stage, the Reformation movements. Imagine a time when profound changes in human belief were taking place, and voices were rising to challenge the absolute authority of the church. A small step taken by a man named Martin Luther would open the door to a major transformation that would shake Europe. It all began in 1517 in the town of Wittenberg, Germany. Martin Luther was a priest who felt deep discomfort with the practices of the Catholic Church. The Church had nearly completely tied the people's connection to God to itself, forcing them to buy indulgences, essentially certificates of forgiveness for their sins. Just think about it, my friends, you're paying the church for forgiveness instead of going directly to God. In response to this injustice, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg church. These theses sharply criticized the corrupt aspects of the church, and with this bold act, Luther plunged a dagger into the heart of the Catholic world. However, this movement wasn't just a reaction of one individual against the church. There was also a long-standing buildup of anger and unrest in the background. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church had been at the center of not only religious authority but also political power. Popes could appoint kings and dismiss emperors. But with the Renaissance, people started to access information more easily, and thanks to the invention of the printing press, ideas spread faster, allowing the public to question their beliefs. Luther's movement was, in fact, a reflection of the thoughts budding in the minds of the people. The Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther, quickly echoed throughout Europe. Luther proclaimed, faith should be between God and man alone, breaking the church's monopoly on sacred rituals. His ideas garnered massive support from both ordinary people and some nobles. Particularly in Germany, this movement spread rapidly among the people, as Luther's ideas offered a glimmer of hope to those tired of the heavy taxes imposed by the church and disturbed by its wealth. This new movement that challenged the church's power led to the birth of a different denomination called Protestantism. But dear friends, this religious transformation also brought along great chaos. The Catholic Church mobilized all its power to suppress this new movement. What started as a theological dispute quickly escalated into a political war. Conflicts erupted between denominations all across Europe. The wave of protests that began in Germany quickly spread to countries like France, England, and Switzerland. Each country reacted differently to this new religious wave. In France, the Protestants turned into a group known as the Huguenots, engaging in bloody wars with the Catholics that lasted for years. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands out as one of the darkest moments of these conflicts, where thousands of Huguenots were brutally killed by Catholics. Europe's lands were practically soaked in blood. In England, things unfolded a bit differently. King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church to serve his own interests. Interestingly, Henry's reform stemmed from a love affair. When the Pope wouldn't allow King Henry to get a divorce, he took radical action and split from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England. This break was another dimension of the religious divide in Europe. England had now become a Protestant country, but tensions between Catholics and Protestants persisted. My dear friends, the Reformation movements were not only a religious transformation, they profoundly affected Europe's political structure as well. Many kingdoms and principalities across Europe took sides according to their religious preferences, leading to major wars between supporters and opponents of these new denominations. The 30 Years' War was the most significant and destructive outcome of these religious divisions. Lasting from 1618 to 1648, this war was one of the bloodiest conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, devastating a large part of Europe. You see, my friends, this religious divide not only opened deep wounds in the spiritual world, but also in the political and social realms. The instability in Europe and the struggles between denominations laid the foundation for a chaos that would last for many years. Yet within this chaos, humanity's faith and thought fought for freedom. Luther's small step had set Europe on an irreversible path. My dear friends, imagine a time when the world map was still uncertain and the seas were filled with endless mysteries. To set sail away from the shores and head toward the horizons, to go beyond the known. The 15th and 16th centuries marked an era of explorers who chased such courage and curiosity. While the intellectual enlightenment of the Renaissance unfolded in Europe, the spirit of this period also spilled over into the seas. Brave sailors set out to seek new worlds in dark waters, opening the doors to an age that would change the course of history, the age of exploration. Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan. These names have become legends over time. Let's follow their trails and see together how these great discoveries changed the world. Until then, people believed the world consisted solely of Europe, Africa, and Asia. But in 1492, an Italian navigator named Columbus set out on a journey to the west, with the support of Queen Isabella of Spain. Columbus believed the shortest route to the east, specifically India, was to go west. But, my dear friends, he made a huge mistake. He actually reached not Asia, but a whole different continent, America. When Columbus discovered the New World, he wasn't even aware of it. However, this discovery became a turning point for Europe. How exciting it was. A continent filled with new lands, new resources, and unknown civilizations. Shortly after Columbus's journey, Vasco da Gama also embarked on a daring sea voyage. He successfully circumnavigated Africa to reach India, thus launching a new era of maritime trade between Europe and Asia. But perhaps the boldest explorer of all was Ferdinand Magellan. His dream was to see the world as a whole, and to embark on a journey that would unite all continents by crossing the oceans. In 1519, Magellan set sail from Spain and charted the route for the first circumnavigation of the globe from west to east. Although he did not complete this journey, as he lost his life in Southeast Asia, one of his ships finished the voyage and returned. This great achievement proved once again how vast our world is, yet how interconnected it is. Of course, these discoveries meant more than just the expansion of seas and lands. When Europe encountered the New World, the economic and social balances of the world were shaken to their core. On one hand, new trade routes were opening; on the other, a dark era known as colonialism was beginning. My friends, for Europe, these newly discovered lands were not just filled with treasures of gold and silver, but also an endless source of raw materials and labor. The Native Americans found themselves powerless against the greedy demands of European explorers. From the moment Columbus set foot in America, Europe began to exploit these lands rapidly. The Spanish and Portuguese conquered Central and South America, seizing gold mines and transporting the continent's wealth back to Europe. However, this brought not only wealth but also diseases. My friends, the epidemic diseases carried from Europe decimated the indigenous populations. Smallpox, influenza, and other plagues wiped out millions of natives. This was a catastrophe for the native peoples of the New World, while it became a vast profit opportunity for Europe. But the Europeans weren't just focused on America. With Vasco da Gama's arrival in India, spices, silk, and precious stones from Asia ignited a trading frenzy in Europe. The spice route was now accessible by sea as well as land. Europe enriched itself with a trade network that stretched from India to China, with cities across the continent transforming into bustling trade centers. Dear friends, the age of exploration was not just about discoveries and trade, but also laid the foundations for colonialism. Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French ships spread across the globe, establishing colonial empires. The lands in America, Africa, and Asia were conquered, people were enslaved, and natural resources were ruthlessly exploited. Especially in Africa, millions of people were subjected to the slave trade, serving Europe and America. However, my friends, these discoveries and colonialism showed their impacts not just economically but also socially and culturally. As Europeans encountered new cultures, they began imposing their own cultures on these lands. The languages, religions, and ways of life of indigenous peoples underwent significant changes under European pressures. While Christianity rapidly spread in the New World, indigenous beliefs and traditions gradually vanished. The Age of Exploration marked the beginning of Europe's dominance over the world. During this period, while Europe grew wealthier, it also inflicted deep wounds on the globe. The pains brought by colonialism were etched into the memories of peoples. Nevertheless, these grand discoveries changed the course of history. The world map was redrawn, and humanity rediscovered how vast and unknown the universe really was. Ah, my dear friends, the Age of Exploration is a period filled with both victories and tragedies. The brave adventures of Europeans at sea became one of the most significant turning points in world history. After these discoveries, the world would never be the same again, and these monumental changes, combined with the enlightened ideas of the Renaissance, shaped the modern world. Ah, my dear friends, let's turn our eyes to the sky. Imagine a time when the veil of time was lifted, and for centuries, people gazed at the stars, trying to understand the world spinning beneath the celestial dome. Yet, oddly enough, for a long time, the Earth was believed to be the center of the universe, with everything revolving around it. These ideas had kept people in the dark for centuries, and were accepted as undeniable truths under the Church's authority. But one day, in a little town in Italy, a man looked up at the sky and thought, what if that man was Copernicus? Dear listeners, Nicolaus Copernicus's name is inscribed in the annals of scientific history in golden letters today. But at the time, his revolutionary thoughts posed a great danger. Copernicus boldly challenged the Church's teachings, stating, "The Earth is not the center of the universe, it revolves around the sun. Just think about it, what an incredible idea." Centuries of steadfast belief were shattered. But my dear friends, this idea had not yet fully gained acceptance. While Copernicus's thoughts were strong enough to shake the established order, it was up to another brave thinker to take the next step. That person was Galileo Galilei. Ah, Galileo, this wise man, who turned his telescope to the heavens, confirmed Copernicus's claims and took it even further by observing the stars and planets. He raised his gaze from the ground and discovered Jupiter's moons for the first time. When Galileo saw the craters on the moon's surface, he realized that the moon was not a perfect sphere. This was a discovery that completely changed humanity's perspective of the universe. Galileo's findings drew the ire of the Church, dear listeners. The Church wanted to silence this scholar who contradicted their teachings that proclaimed, "The Earth is the center." Galileo was brought to trial and threatened with excommunication. Yet, those famous words from Galileo echo in our ears, "Et per se muove." And yet, it moves. As science rose against the pressures of the Church, Another great mind, Johannes Kepler, was studying the movements of the planets. Kepler used the power of mathematics and astronomy to discover that the planets traveled in elliptical orbits. Until then, it was thought that planets moved in circular paths, but Kepler dispelled that misconception and revealed the workings of the universe in a new light. So, my dear friends, step by step, the mystery of the universe was being unraveled thanks to the work of these new scientists. But the real leap came from another genius from England, Isaac Newton. Newton. You've all heard the story of how he discovered gravity while sitting under an apple tree, right? Of course, that's just a legend, but Newton's discoveries were far deeper than any myth. He formulated not only the laws of gravity, but also the laws of motion. He proved that the laws of nature were universal and applied everywhere. Whether the apple fell to the ground or the moon hung in the sky, the same laws were at work. Newton's work, Principia Mathematica, became one of the cornerstones of the natural sciences. He opened a new window for understanding the physical order of the world and led a revolutionary change in the world of science. Dear friends, Newton's discoveries not only accepted scientific methods but also ushered in a new era of science. The world was no longer explained through supernatural powers as it once was. Scientific observation, experimentation, and logic could explain events, unraveling the secrets of the universe one by one. As scientists stood against the teachings of the Church, the barriers to free thought began to slowly lift. However, it's important to remember that these scientific revolutions also brought about a major conflict with the Church. The Church saw these new thoughts from scientists as a threat, claiming they were opposing God's order. Galileo's trial was not just an individual event, it was a significant struggle for the freedom of science. But science persevered despite all these challenges, my friends. The human mind was determined to solve the mysteries of the universe with a desire to question and learn. With the scientific revolution, humanity's perspective of the universe changed forever. The revolutionary ideas of Copernicus, the brave observations of Galileo, Kepler's elliptical orbits, and Newton's laws of nature were giant steps on the path to understanding the world. This revolution showed us once again how important it is to pursue the truth, like a light shining in the darkness of ignorance. And so, dear listeners, the scientific revolution became a fruit of humanity's efforts to understand nature through rationality and observation. This conflict with the Church resulted in the acceptance of the scientific method. The world was now seen not as a secret of God, but as a system waiting to be discovered. Think about that moment in time when Europe's destiny was changed forever. The fresh breeze of the Renaissance was bringing a different sound from the prayers echoing in cathedral churches. This new age wasn't just about art and science, my friends. The political landscape of Europe was also starting to shake. As the rule of feudal lords and barons began to fade, kings and queens were laying the foundations for powerful monarchies. The spirit of the time was evolving into an era where the authority of landowners was melting away, and central kingdoms were gaining strength. Every ray of light entering through the door opened by the Renaissance was illuminating not just the canvases of artists, but also the throne rooms of governments. The changes brought by the Renaissance were shaped not by a painter's brushstrokes, but by the strategic moves of kings across Europe. During this time, countries like Spain, France, and England were shedding the old feudal structure and transforming into strong, centralized monarchies. Feudal lords, who once had absolute power over their lands, were now overshadowed by the political strength of kings and queens. Once small principalities ruled by local lords had become mere pieces of massive kingdoms. This was the era of the strengthening of monarchies. Kings were expanding their territories, strengthening their armies, and their economic resources were making them the most powerful players in Europe. But let's not forget that it wasn't just the monarchies that were facing a significant test during this time. The Renaissance and the subsequent Reformation movements were causing profound changes in Europe. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church had been highly influential in state affairs. The words of the popes were among the greatest forces shaping kings' decisions. However, with the rise of secularism during the Renaissance, the Church's absolute authority over society began to weaken. Under the leadership of reformers like Martin Luther, the criticisms aimed at the Church weren't just the 30 Years' War. Ah, dear friends, the storms of those dark days still echo in Europe's memory. Once ruled by the favor of gods and kings, these lands were now soaked in the blood spilled in the name of faith. The 30 Years' War wasn't just a battle. My dear listeners, it was one of the bloodiest religious conflicts Europe had seen for centuries. The heavy stone walls of churches bore witness to prayers from both Protestants and Catholics. But in the shadows of those prayers, guns, swords, and cannons spoke loudly. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants went beyond just a struggle for power among a handful of men. Nations across Europe rushed to the battlefields for the sake of their beliefs, leaving behind death, destruction, and flames that would not be extinguished. The spark for this war ignited in 1618 in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in Prague. Protestant nobles were fed up with the oppression of the Catholic regime. On that day, the defenestration of Prague, there happened at Prague Castle, where officials were thrown out of a window, marking the beginning of the conflict. This was no simple rebellion, it was the first step toward a reckoning over faith. What followed was as deep and dark as rivers. Countries all over Europe were drawn into this war. The German lands bore the heaviest burden of this conflict. Villages burned, fields lay fallow, and people were ravaged by hunger and disease. But this war didn't just involve Germans, it drew in many states from Denmark to Sweden and from France to Spain. It was such chaos that nearly all of Europe was swept into this religious and political storm. The clash between Catholics and Protestants lasted over 20 years and decimated a generation. So, dear friends, what remained after this war? Just broken churches? No, much more. The scars left by the 30 Years' War ran deep across Europe. It wasn't just a clash of arms, it was a time when beliefs and nations were reshaped. At the end of the war, people witnessed not only the religious changes but also how political balances shifted. The Holy Roman Empire weakened, while states like France grew stronger. The millions who died on German soil left a painful echo in the memories of kingdoms and peoples. And at the bloody war's end, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia arrived. It was a peace treaty, yes, but it was more than that. On that day, the diplomatic order of Europe changed completely. The Peace of Westphalia didn't just declare the war over. It laid the groundwork for interstate relations. The days when religion ruled politics in Europe would be behind them. A balance was established between Protestants and Catholics, but more importantly, the sovereignty rights of independent states were recognized. A king or emperor would no longer interfere in their neighbors' beliefs or governance. This marked the birth of modern diplomacy. It was a system where the borders of states were sacred, and no other power could intervene in those borders. The balance of power in Europe had shifted, and now kings would protect their thrones not in the name of religion, but for the interests of the state. One of the most important outcomes of the Peace of Westphalia was shaping the concept of nationalism in Europe. States were no longer seen merely as the lands of a king or emperor, they began to be viewed as reflections of national identities and cultures. Religion took a back seat in governance, and the foundations of modern states were laid during this period. Ah, dear listeners, wars are always painful, but sometimes from these pains, a new order emerges. The 30 Years' War may have claimed thousands of lives, but the Peace of Westphalia became a milestone that built Europe's future. Now, Europe was very different from its old days. Kings and queens were seated on their thrones according to the new order's rules, and diplomacy replaced the battlefields. This peace agreement didn't declare an end to all wars in Europe, of course, but at least it calmed the raging storms behind the religious conflicts. Europe was now ready to step into the modern world, and these steps were shaped by lessons learned from the bloody pages of the past. And so, dear friends, this story, stretching from the fiery days of the 30 Years' War to the cooling winds of the Peace of Westphalia, rewrote the fate of Europe. But this story doesn't end here. The new diplomatic order across Europe didn't just bring peace, it also laid the groundwork for new wars. My dear friends, after the 30 Years' War, a new breeze began to blow across Europe. This new order, shaped by diplomacy moving from battlefields to negotiating tables, changed not just the rhythm of thrones but also the streets and marketplaces. This period marked the beginning of what we now call the early modern era, as kings and emperors sought to solidify their thrones. Another power was emerging in Europe, the bourgeoisie. Yes, that old feudal system was slowly starting to unravel. The nobles, who had been the lords of the land for centuries, were now living in the shadow of this new class. This rising class was wealthy, strengthened by trade, and on the rise in cities. The bourgeoisie changed the face of Europe not just with their wealth, but with their ideas as well. Capitalism. This term might not have meant what it does today back then, but its roots were planted in those years. After the great maritime discoveries, trade routes expanded, and the sounds of commerce echoed everywhere, from the port cities of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic shores, from Asia's spice routes to the gold mines of the New World. Countries like Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands were the main players in this new trading network. These networks didn't just transport goods and wealth, they also transformed Europe's economic structure. The feudal lord's land-bound system was giving way to the rising stock exchanges, banks, and overseas investments in the cities. In this early phase of capitalism, the wealthy bourgeoisie didn't just gain economic power, they also triggered a significant shift in the social structure of society. The sharp hierarchy between nobles and peasants, present during the Middle Ages, gave way to a more complex social fabric. Now the merchants, bankers, and artisans trading in the cities, while not as powerful as the nobles, no longer lived in their shadow. Wealth had become a new source of respect and influence in society. The power that once rested in the hands of those wielding swords had shifted to those managing ledgers and gold-filled coffers. The rise of the bourgeoisie was one of the clearest signs that the feudal order was beginning to crumble. But change wasn't just happening in the cities, significant transformations were also occurring in the countryside. The agricultural revolution became another cornerstone of Europe's economic structure. More efficient farming methods allowed for better land cultivation. Peasants were no longer just producing enough for themselves, they were starting to engage in trade to sell surplus in the cities. As demand in the cities grew, a new era began where agriculture intertwined with commerce. The old feudal lords tried to invest more in their lands to boost productivity, but as a result, migration from villages to cities accelerated. Cities became not only the homes of nobles, but also sought-after living spaces for wealthy merchants, bankers, and artisans. This migration changed the landscape of cities. The small walled towns of the past transformed into modern cities with wide streets, bustling marketplaces, and grand buildings. In these cities, not only trade was thriving, but ideas were also spreading rapidly. With the rise of the printing press, books, pamphlets, and newspapers circulated, and new ideas found a significant audience, especially among the bourgeoisie. The artists and thinkers of the Renaissance became the patrons of this new class in the cities, because the bourgeoisie wanted to be recognized not just for material wealth, but also for intellectual richness. In Italy's city-states, families like the Medici supported the arts and sciences, while wealthy merchants across Europe provided patronage to painters, scientists, and philosophers. With the development of trade and agriculture, this new bourgeois class fundamentally changed the social fabric of Europe. The old feudal hierarchy was collapsing, making way for wealthy merchants, bankers, and a new class growing in the cities. While the king's power might still have been strong, this new class began to shake the foundations of thrones not just with wealth, but with ideas. And so, my dear friends, the birth of capitalism, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and the growth of cities in early modern Europe marked the beginning of not just an economic and social revolution, but also a political and cultural one. Europe, through this transformation, was breaking the chains of the old world and laying the foundations for the modern world. But this story doesn't end here. This movement would propel Europe into wars, reforms, and revolutions, forever changing the course of world history. Ah, my dear listeners, as time changed, the sparks of reason and knowledge began to shine in the sky. Toward the end of the 17th century, a spark ignited all across Europe. This spark first appeared quietly, but soon turned into a flame, illuminating minds and shaking the roots of established thoughts. This was the first spark of the Enlightenment. Once hidden in the shadows of the Dark Ages, human thought was now breaking free, shattering its chains, and embarking on a journey in search of truth. The Enlightenment wasn't a movement that emerged overnight. Its roots went much deeper, hidden in the intellectual wealth that the Renaissance had planted. Remember, my friends, during that great Renaissance period, artists, scientists, and thinkers emerged from the dark corridors of the Middle Ages, reconnecting with the light of knowledge from ancient times. This legacy paved the way for humanity to take its first steps toward reason. This new wave of thinking, which began with the Renaissance, grew with scientific revolutions, and by the late 17th century, this intellectual awakening had become unstoppable. But you might wonder why such a massive change occurred. The answer lies in the enormous social and political transformations happening in Europe. With the progress of science and art, people could no longer rely solely on the teachings of the church and kings. Scientists searching for different ways to access knowledge began to understand the world better through observation and experimentation. Newton's law of gravity, Galileo's observations of stars through a telescope, Descartes' shouting, "I think, therefore I am," all of these were revolutionary steps pushing the limits of human reason. And of course, these steps laid the foundations of the Enlightenment. But do you know what truly illuminated the Enlightenment? The deep yearning people had for reason and freedom. Those who had long been accustomed to living under the yoke of the church and monarchies were now burning with the desire to express their thoughts and determine their destinies. Imagine, for centuries, kings and clerics dictated how people should think and what they should believe. But now, with the first sparks of the Enlightenment, people were questioning. They were asking why. Why should we accept the world as it is? Why should we hand over our freedom to a handful of elites? During this period, an intellectual storm was brewing in Europe. In coffee houses, salons, and universities, people were passionately debating, books were being written, and pamphlets were being passed around. Knowledge was beginning to be seen not just as the privilege of a select few, but as the right of the people. This idea rapidly spread from the late 17th century onward, fundamentally changing the social order. And here's where the legacy of the Renaissance comes into play. The Renaissance not only taught people the importance of art, science, and philosophy, it also reminded them of human potential and freedom. The great works of Leonardo and Michelangelo showcased how much people could achieve. People were starting to see themselves not just as shadows of God on earth, but as beings capable of thinking, creating, and discovering on their own. And the Enlightenment was born from this newfound self-confidence. People began to seek their rights not only in scientific and artistic fields, but also in political and social realms. These sparks gradually began to illuminate the darkness of the early modern period. With the collapse of the feudal order, the shaking of monarchies, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and the expansion of trade routes, Europe was stepping into a new era. The Enlightenment heralded this new period. People were no longer willing to accept the absolute authority of either kings or churches. The pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice had begun. The first sparks of the Enlightenment resonated not only in the realm of thought, but in every aspect of society. Political structures were changing, new ideas were budding, and people were looking to the future with hope. However, the results of this storm would be much greater. The Enlightenment would open the doors to a revolution that would affect not just Europe, but the entire world. And so, my friends, this journey, which began with the legacy of the Renaissance, continued with the light of the Enlightenment. The thinkers of this period taught us how valuable not only knowledge but also freedom is. The Enlightenment paved the way for the end of the early modern period, and this path would herald the French Revolution, the American War of Independence, and many other social transformations. Ah, my dear friends, we've come to the end of a long journey. We've traveled from the first sparks of the Renaissance to the tumultuous years of the early modern period. History has swept us along. We've traced the paths of great changes, rises and falls. But now, as we conclude this journey, it's time to pause and reflect. The Renaissance and the early modern period didn't just stay within their own time, they left deep marks that shape our world today. Even now, we continue to feel the echoes of that era. The Renaissance taught humanity something incredibly important, that we have the power to shape our own destiny. When the vast treasures of knowledge from ancient times were rediscovered, Europe experienced a new enlightenment. People stopped simply looking to the heavens for God's will and began to turn their gaze to the earth, recognizing their own strength and potential. Art, science, philosophy, all of these became reflections of this new understanding of humanity. The legacy of the Renaissance is the discovery of the limitless power of human intellect. The ability of people to understand the world, change it, and determine their own fate shone brightly during this period. Of course, the Renaissance was not just a movement of art or science. With the early modern period, this change extended into political and social realms as well, kings, churches, and feudal lords. All of them either tried to establish a new order in the face of this transformation, or were crushed under its weight. The great kingdoms of Europe began to control trade routes, explore the world, and gain new powers. The foundations of capitalism were laid, and with the rise of trade and the bourgeoisie, social hierarchies were turned upside down. As society began to dismantle old structures, the foundations of a new order were being established. But my friends, this transformation was not limited to Europe. The impacts of the Renaissance and early modern period spread across the globe. Through geographic discoveries, Europe reached America, Asia, and Africa. Trade, colonization, and cultural exchanges gained momentum. The power dynamics shaped during this time continue to leave their mark, not just on that era, but also on our world today. The Eurocentric world order was built during that time, and even now, it's impossible to ignore this legacy in international relations, economic systems, and cultural exchanges. The Renaissance is not just a period of history that belongs to the past, it's a bridge to our current world. The paths they opened have led us to the realms of science, art, and thought today. From Newton's discoveries to Descartes' philosophy, from Michelangelo's sculptures to Shakespeare's works. All this legacy points to one of the brightest periods in human history. That's why the Renaissance is not just a renewal, it's also a reminder. Humans are not only capable of understanding the world, but also of changing it. The people of that era were perhaps the first to realize this profound truth. And today, my dear friends, we inherit this legacy. The teachings of the Renaissance and the early modern period remind us that we must never forget the power of reason and freedom. That great awakening showed us how creative, brave, and powerful humans can be. The foundations of the world we live in today were laid by the great revolutions of those days: democracy, science, art, and freedom of thought. All of these are the legacies of the Renaissance. And that's why this period in history isn't just a story from the past. We still carry the traces of those great transformations today. It's up to us to keep the teachings of the Renaissance and the early modern period alive, to elevate the mind and heart of humanity even higher. That's why, my friends, history is not just knowledge to be learned, it's a compass that shapes our present and future. That compass leads us down the path of reason, science, and freedom. Now, my friends, we've reached the end of this long journey. But remember, history never truly ends. The fire of the Renaissance hasn't been extinguished, that fire continues to illuminate the world today. And we are writing our own stories beneath that light.